Okay, yeah, will do. All right, everybody, welcome again to another OpenShift Commons briefing. Today is Friday, and as we want to do on Fridays, we have folks to talk about transformation, organizational transformation, cultural shifts, and all those kinds of wonderful things. And on today, we have with us John Willis from the Global Transformation Office, and he's going to have a conversation about conversations, organizational conversations. I'm going to let John take it away and introduce himself, and we'll have live Q&A at the end. So John, take it away. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Diane. Thanks for everything you do for this. This is an awesome. You and Chris, thank you so much. Yeah, so organizational conversations, what the heck is this? Hopefully I'll give you some insight of what I've been thinking about for the last 2 or 3 years, and actually having some fun at Red Hat doing some of this stuff too. So John Willis, I'm part of the Global Transformation Office, and Jay Willis at Red Hat. Our team, if you've been coming here on Fridays, you've probably gotten to meet Andrew Clay Schaefer. He's my boss, one of my best friends. I've been working with him for years. We kind of co-created on the shoulder of giants with many other people, but the DevOps movement. Kevin Bear next to him is the one of the authors of the Phoenix Project. That's me on the short guy there. And then Jay Bloom to my right has been working with Kevin for years, and I've known all these guys for years, and they're just, I say that I feel like I'm Willy Wonka in the chocolate factory working with these guys. It's just an amazing team to be on. Andrew likes to say we wrote some books, so I was the co-author of the DevOps Handbook and the Beyond the Phoenix Project, and I've got a fair amount of other publications that wouldn't fit on a page, but. So one of the things that, I started thinking about, I won't give you my resume, go to my LinkedIn profile, Jay Willis, I think it's John Willis, Atlanta, something nonsensical like that. But I was at Docker, and, I had been like 12 years in vendor space. Chef, I was very early chef. I sold a company at Dell. I sold a company at Docker. And by the time I was ready to leave Docker, I was really excited about going out and being independent. I built enough mind share with the community. Before I had that run, which was about 12, maybe 15 years, with, nobody really knew me. By the time I was sort of ready to leave Docker, which is about 3 years ago, I built up enough mind share with the community. I thought, okay, I'm going to put a shingle out. I'm going to consult, and I thought, okay, I'm going to use all the things in DevOps Handbook: lean value stream mapping, impact mapping, just blah, this, hosting, carry, all these different things. Sorry, I mangled that. But lean. And in my first client, I realized every time I tried to inject a framework or a model, the conversation just stopped. And then, so I started going on this idea that, like, if you really want to find the truth, and you really went to the core of an organization's sort of behavior or problems, you can't lean, agile, safe, or even, sorry, kids, even SRE your way around a bad organizational culture, or more importantly, bad, institutionalized, sort of memory muscle, bad behaviors. So I started, I didn't know, I still don't really know what a great name of it is. I'm pretty sure Organizational Conversations is not. It's just the one I've called it organizational anthropology. Other people have given it names to me, but it's really an idea where I just literally go in and I have conversations with people. So typically I get to work. The only way this works is I work with usually a CIO. I say, here's how this is going to work. In fact, what typically happens is people will say, John, can you come in and sprinkle pixie dust all over our DevOps? And I'm like, yeah, sorry, it doesn't work that way. But what I can do is do this. And very few companies, and I'll be honest with you, a lot of times I'm interviewing the CIO because, some chief of staff or somebody will bring me into CIO, tell the CIO, you need to hear John, you need to hear what he has to talk. And I'll, at the end of that, I'll go back to the person, the champion that tried to get me in there. And I'm like, you know what, your CIO is not ready for this. Like, you will be wasting your time and wasting your money. Right. So there's a synergy that I find where a CIO is willing to say, you know what, I'm going to take a try on this. And then they blast out, please pay attention. Don't bring your laptops, unless it's a fire, but sit in the room with this person for an hour and a half or 2 hours in different groups and let him ask you questions. And when the CEO does that, most people show up, right? And the one thing I've learned back to the frameworks, like my instinct is as a trainer, as somebody who speaks and tries to always sort of educate people, which is my nature, whether I'm presenting or not, is that when you're in these conversations, you want to correct people if they say something like, "Oh, let me teach you." So that's not, you can't do that. You need to just listen, and that's sort of anybody who's trying this model. Just make sure, because again, what you don't want to do is when you're into like 30 minutes of 15 or 20 people having this great conversation, telling you how things really work. You don't want anything to derail that. So the other thing I think a lot about is, Andrew Clay Schaefer, I think he's the first time I've seen it in the DevOps world. He took, Andrew's great at like metaphors. He's awesome. He did the blind, DevOps, sort of a DevOps, blind person and, sort of the elephant. And it's an old sort of metaphor. And I look at this as like that, this is what leadership, right? There's sort of the CEO is touching the trunk and he thinks it's a snake. Maybe the CTO, she's touching the tail and she thinks it's a rope, on and on, right? But the thing is, it's this is sort of systemic of the problem, right? You have the blind IT, right, where dev is touching and possibly just really just trash the metaphor. The leadership one is is a purple elephant, and the IT one is an orange elephant. So they again not even be able to see that the context is different from release and network and dev, right? And like so, this is just what and we all know this, right? IT is an elephant, right? In today's world, it's a very, very complex structure. And I thought I'd have a little more fun, that maybe governance, risk, and compliance, it's not even an elephant, right? It's not even just a different color. It's the giant attacking rabbit, the Trojan rabbit, right? Monty Python, right? So I hope you get the point, right? Like that is the problem, right? Our sort of our context, our individual, our team, our group, even our leadership context are we see things with different memory models or models, cognitive models, right? And so that's just human nature, right? So right off the bat, we're hosed. No, we'll do fine. So there's this notion, if you've ever started a company, or you do start a company, you'll be told very early by somebody, usually your lawyer, that there's this thing called piercing the corporate veil, which means that if you don't act like a corporation, the IRS could come in and say you have no, you have no journals, you have no sort of meeting notes. Anyway, they call it piercing the corporate veil. But I think this is like what I call piercing the organizational veil, right? Which is, the veil is this adversarial relationship of consultants come in, and then the people who are sort of doing the work are like, well, here comes the Bobs, right? The Bobs in office hours, a classic example, right? Like you don't want to tell them anything, or you're afraid to tell them anything, or you need to always spin things that they're better than they aren't because you don't want to be the one that gets fired. So what I have to do is come in and earn trust, or somebody who sort of evolves this model, earn trust so they don't seem like the bombs. And I can't ask you questions like, how is your CMDB? How accurate is it? Oh, John, it's fine, and no open critical vulnerabilities or CVS on your production system. Oh, no, not at all, John. Don't worry, right? Like, so you have to sort of gamify a little bit, but it's a trust. It's a getting people to sort of open up to you. And actually, it's not that hard. Sometimes I walk in a room and I just say, "Hey, what's wrong with this place?" And then I just take notes for another hour and a half. And you can't shut people up. And so it's conversations at the edge. It's another really important thing about this is that a lot of times when I come in, I've been called the anti-McKinsey, right, which is like such a compliment, right? So I shouldn't call it any. So think of McKinsey as any one of the large consulting companies, but the model of most of our industry is they come in and they already know what they're going to tell you, and they do a little bit of lip service to we want to listen, but they don't really. They're just trying to convince senior leadership that they've listened and that they have the right answer. And so one of the things about this model, and I call it a model as a stretch too, I don't really know what it is yet, other than I know it works, is that I honestly, even though I have lots of sort of meta and process of how to do things, as an educator, as an implementer, as a, quote unquote thought leader, which is a terrible phrase, but for lack of a better one. But I really try not to go in with the solution. And the other thing is, I don't really want to have an in-depth conversation with the leadership. I want to have, you'll see some examples in a model in a minute, but I want to have long, long conversations with people, what I call on the edge, the people who put their fingers on the keyboard. And if you can get enough of them to tell you what's going on, you give this beautiful look of outside in that most organizations have never really done to this level. Surveys, they don't work, right? Or let me speak, they don't give you this level of truth and depth to what your problems really are. I mean, I can generically walk in the door and say, you're a bank, I'm pretty sure you have this, and this problem. And chances are I'm about 80% right. And anybody else who has a reasonable understanding of what we do in things called DevOps or transformation. But the truth is, I don't really know if I'm right. When I know I'm right is when I can connect the dots from what people say, right? So, and the other thing I realized over time is, when you're going in and you're doing all this sort of analysis, or basically you're just discovery. I mean, you're just taking notes with hundreds of people. And then you have to figure out, like, how do I take all this stuff? Because Joe said, oh my goodness, we have no sense of priority here. Sue says, well, our budgets are, ridiculous. We get yearly budgets and they change every 3 weeks on what we should do, right? And you're not getting all that stuff in like categorized discussions. They're like, when you go back to your notes. And then so the first thing I realized is I had to come up with these sort of buckets in a reasonable way to sort of capture. I mean, and not all things are perfect. There certainly are other buckets, but I use this as my framing for how I go about trying to do like a qualitative analysis of everything I heard. And typically it stems into these 7. It could have been 6. It could have been 8. 7 just sounds cooler. Invisible work. We'll talk a little about that. It's about work that's just, downstream dependencies that aren't captured, work that isn't captured because you have so many different management systems. Management system toil. Probably the worst offender of management system toil is when I work in an organization and I find they have 7 ways to capture work. SharePoint, Jira, messages, email, remedy tickets, right? Work tickets and remedies, ARS, and none of that's aggregated or correlated, and in the end, a lot of data is missing from what you actually do. So it stems back to invisible. And then misaligned a sentence. We know that's a great narrative of the DevOps story, but we think the roadmap is this, but then I've been told I have to do this. And even the dev and ops is this classic core chronic conflict, right? Classically dev wants to move fast and get things out the door. Operations is resilience and scale, and we need so again the whole and again in those classic scenario, operations will get rewarded by reducing impact, incidents, and those things. Development will get rewarded based on delivering things on time and features, right? And right there's a misalignment. And tribal knowledge. For any of you have read the Phoenix Project, right? The Brent, classic example. There are these sort of pockets of tacit knowledge that the people just don't know. And when you start interviewing people, and you'll get a flock of younger people who'll be like, I just never know how to do this. And then some sort of seasoned person in the back of the room will say, oh, that's easy. You just go to Bob. And they're like, yeah, I went to Bob, but he's too busy. And and I asked Bob, could you explain how you do this? And Bob's like, I'd love to, but I don't have time, right? So the whole Brent character, who is, and the more often than not, it's not the person who's trying to preserve their job. It's just somebody who likes to help everybody and tends to be, doesn't really realize they're a bottleneck, right? I think at one point somebody categorized Brent as a rotten person, and Gene Kim, who wrote the book, was like, like, oh my God, no, if you read it that way, that was totally not what we wanted. And Kevin Barra was a big part of who works on GTO, was a big part of that Brent character as well. Incongruent organizational design, we can go on and on. Anywhere from, and it's not just sort of the sort of not waterfall, but microservices versus monoliths, right? That's a part of a sort of inverse Conway maneuver, if you're familiar with Conway's law. But it's organizational as well. There's a great story, the Equifax breach, right, where the CISO reported to the chief legal officer, and when they did, the Congress actually did a postmortem. If you haven't read it, it's a fantastic document. They interviewed the CISO, and they asked, when you knew that the PII, and there was a compromise, why didn't you go to the CIO? And the answer was, I didn't think of it. And that's a classic, I think, Conway Lawrism, in that their mindset was all the things that were required from a legal perspective, right? So incongruent organizational design, just understanding complexity, right? Through this, we'll talk a little later about incidents, and just understanding that these are complex systems. You need to have system thinking. You need to understand blameless. It's a whole different way of thinking about failure. And then last but certainly not least, security. And what I love about this model is it almost always funnels down to something that I call security and compliance data. So let me move on a little bit. This is just a model from Elliot Gorat, who was the person who wrote the goal, and that the Phoenix Project was modeled off. It's about thinking about complexity in a different way. In a lot of ways, when you go into an organization and you start asking questions, they start giving you these abstract answers which are basically telling you stories, where what you really need to do is find out. So I don't want those first order answers of the problem. Like, John, the CMD is fine. Okay, let me ask you, what did you do last time when you had to deal with a remedy for sort of some incident to find all the systems that were impacted? Like, I use my spreadsheet. Oh, why didn't you use the CMDB? Oh, because it's a piece of junk. It's not accurate. And so the process I go through is I've kind of over time gotten into model. It's a little different now. I've done a couple virtual, it's just different. One client, it's like one of the top 3 or 4 banks in the world, I did last summer. I spent 30 days in London. That shouldn't give you a hint, but I actually became a bachelor, and I interviewed 400 people. I just stayed there. I actually got to go to a pub at night, which is like a lifelong dream of mine. But the process is, you have these initial calls. I'll talk about this pre-assessment leadership call. I say I don't really want to hear from leadership too much, but there's a little bit of a head fake process I go through. And then there's the online analysis. And to be clear, although I'm not a scientist, I do work with a couple now, but it's qualitative analysis, not quantitative, right? I'm not just counting the things. I'm literally trying to put categories: initial readout, report, final report. This is an example of that large financial institution I did last summer. 300 to 50 assessment team meetings. It was actually it was more than 200 people. It was in the neighborhood of 350. 400 pages. In fact, this book, right? I'm getting better at creating systems that I don't have to have notebooks, but I'm just old school. See how, if you look at that notebook, it's color coded and stuff. So those become the categories. I literally had a DCIO at this bank at the end. So one of the things I don't do is I write down everything everybody says, but as part of the qualitative analysis, a fancy way to say it, I aggregate the stuff. Nobody's name gets bubbled up. It's all like, I've heard this thing 15 times. I'm pretty sure this is one of the most important things that we should probably address. And then I use it for a quote wall if I get called on by the CIO. But I'll never call anybody out for what I wrote down as a quote. But I had a DCIO offer me $10,000 for this book after they were already paying me big money for the engagement, right? This was a personal, and the answer was no. Sorry, that's my promise to the people I interview. this is the thing. I actually got this from Kevin Bear. You know, if I haven't said I love working with my GTO team, let me say it again. I love working with my GTO team. The Kevin Bear, and he says it's from Elliot Gorat, which, you know, that's great, right? Even better is this idea. Like I figured out, and I don't do this all the time. It just depends on the circumstance. But when I get to interview leaders, I want to ask questions a different way. So one of the things that this technique is really works well is you walk in the room and you're in the office and they're about to tell you their resume and what they did. Like, oh, hold on a second. Before we get started, I want to ask you a question. And you say, what are the 5 things that XYZ, your corp, is not doing that it should do? And then they're like, oh, it's like you just threw water in their, cold water in their face. They're like, huh. And then the next thing you know, they just start rattling stuff off. And then sometimes you got to stop them at 10 or 15 and only ask for 5. And I've had comments like, wow, this was therapeutic. Or I can't believe I just told you all that stuff, right? It really, and it really sets the foundation. In fact, I was forced to do this because I had to prove that this would work to one CIO. So they wanted to start off with a smaller engagement. And I typically would say no to that, but it was doing it for a friend, a real friend that brought me in. And, you know, he needed something to change there. And, you know, when I went back to say, oh, this is your leadership, like, you know, your number one problem is communication. And everybody in the organization told her that it was capacity. And she knew it wasn't capacity. Even when the big 4 told it was capacity. They told them they had to consolidate offices and like all this stuff. And their number one problem for the leadership team was communication, right? And like she didn't know what it was, but she knew there was something ahead of capacity, right? And that's what got the rest of the engagement going. And you know, the obvious findings that you see everywhere is high waste, high wait times, silos, obviously variation, low collaboration, low trust, low visibility, low automation. But the key is, again, you know, and I've done this, so, and my friends do this, and our industry does this, you know, companies come in and say, let us train you on this new technique. And then so you get this like training budget and you go in and you learn all this really cool stuff. But you didn't ask and you didn't know what the problem was first. Right? Like, and the training probably will fit. You know, there are some great, I'm actually going to show some of the examples of roadmaps that I give from people who do training, including Red Hat, of course. But like the idea of just coming in and creating a training budget for like 1,000 people on some new thing, when you haven't even asked the people who do the work, what's wrong? Maybe I'm crazy, you know. Maybe I'm living on an island all by myself. I wish I was right now, but hey, the so but then we get into the sort of rote like meetings and like virtual is a little different, but you know, just the nature of virtual is, you know, normally what I do is try to have one meeting for a whole day, another meeting for a whole day. Now doing hour and a half, 2-hour meetings. It just, you know, virtual and all that just makes sense. It's just, and it actually, I didn't think it would work. It's actually working better than I thought. And then I have to go through some process of qualitative analysis and actually, again, working with a guy like Jay Bloom, right? Jay has got a PhD in design transition, and like we're going to work together. Sorry, Jabe, if you're listening, I've already recruited you, but to make me a better scientist. Although I was talking to John Allspar the other day, who does this stuff on incident, and he says that maybe one of the things that might make this great is I'm not a sort of academic based scientist. I don't know. We'll figure it out. Top 5: visibility, prioritization, toil, inconsistency, risk. But here's the thing: I don't know. I mean, more likely these are the problems. You know, if you're a 100-year-old bank and you're sort of early on your transformation and you've got sort of pockets of DevOpsisms, you know, probably 3 or 4 of these are going to hit. And I could walk in as a high paid consultant and throw my DevOps handbook at you and say, I know how to fix this, right? But like I don't until I listen, right? You know, and then, you know, so like, all right, so now it gets a little sort of easier. So now you're mapping all the analysis to the top. And here's the other thing too, right? Not all parts of your organization move at the same speed. You can't just tell everybody, hey, let's safe on Monday and the world will be awesome. But you have to meet people where they are. Like the legacy mainframe people, like I started my career. The one thing that makes this really cool for me is you can't stop me. Right? Like you can start asking about COBOL on DB2 on IBM mainframe. I'm like, yeah, I started my career as writing IBM mainframe assembler for 10 years, like WASMQ, JBoss, of course, or RabbitMQ, or you just go down the list, right, of all these different systems that but the point is, this is just an example. The real magic is figuring out your capacity, the different speeds. How do you apply different techniques at different speeds in the organization? It's not like just, hey, everybody DevOps. Well, wait a minute. Some people are ready, some people are not. So when I say this, I do think there are some common themes. I kind of call it the operator's guide, right? You want to create an operator's guide, or if you want to be fancy, call it XYZ Kata, XYZ Corporation Kata, or or the shared agreement, right? I was talking to a company the other day where their new CIO really understands what he's doing, and he has this idea how he's going to refactor the organizational structure. Ask me if is it sound? I'm like, yes, that's sound, but it will fail if you don't have that operator's guide across all those things, these common things that we all have to understand as the true norths, right? And so, of course, automation, but taxonomy, like maturity, like again, going back to the speeds, like you want to get everybody to the same place, true north, but you figure, some people, and there's different maturity models, badging, or different things that may or may not work. But the point is, somebody might start off as yellow, somebody might be orange, somebody be light green, right? And like the point is, you're going to get them all in sort of directionally the same way. And then I find taxonomy might be one of the biggest problems in organizations is people use about 10 different terms, and there's basically 1,000 variations of those 10 different terms. So people having meetings and they don't even know they're not talking about the same thing. It's just amazing how just simplifying a common taxonomy in an organization might actually be the most easiest thing to do and solve such a large variety of problems. Learning, understand team turnover, how you organize teams. You might say we're agile and we're doing, we do sprints and scrum, and then I find out that what you're really doing is do whack-a-mole on teams. You're putting a bunch of people together for like 6 sprints, then you're reallocating them to some other places. And I'll talk a little about cognition and load and learning of teams a little bit. And then depending on how old your bank is, you might be bogged down in NFRs or, service management, idle processing, sometimes, banded under GRC. You might have groups that are leaving at incredibly slow paces. It is amazing to me to walk into a top 15 bank today and still hear in 2020 that it takes, 2 to 4 weeks to get a compute instance. The one I heard recently would blow me away is, hey, John, it takes me about 1.5 to 2 minutes to get an Amazon instance, but it takes me another 2 weeks to use it. Like, what are we doing here, folks? Right? Right? Like you have to figure this out. So if you keep thinking that, and I'm a big fan of cloud. I'm a big fan, if you don't know me, of containers, OpenShift. I think the platform model is the right way for the future. But like, if you're building all this stuff on a platform and there are people out there that you're not talking to and saying that platform is great, but it still takes me 2 weeks to get a compute instance to run a test, right? General visibility, I won't go through all these. We'll make this deck available. Inconsistent road. This is the thing where it's not like what's on the screen. It's what's going on, right? Which is, like there are these sort of notional beginning of year roadmaps. And then, 6 or 8 months, the people that I talk to, like, they have no idea what we're doing. They think we're doing all this, but every 3 weeks I'm told to change to do this. Too many practice, way more projects than there are people. So having not even the visibility to just show the chart that you are over your allocation of what you believe is the capacity that you're running is 150 beyond, and that's not even counting the hidden work that doesn't get calculated in the yearly budgets, and bottlenecks, too much work in progress. Like there's not even sort of a sense of WIP going on, right? Or if it is, it's localized. Like I'll run out of time, I'm sure, but sorry. The thing I love, like, is, and I'm not an agile expert, and I learn enough to be smart I learn enough from the really smart people and to be smart enough to be able to have the smart conversations, if that even makes sense. So, but when I walk in a room and I talk to a bunch of people and I talk about story points and all that, and I already know they're date driven. I mean, I know they're date driven, right? Like, I don't have to be an expert in all things agile and Scrum and everything else. I just, like simple math. I know they're date driven and I want to hear them explain story points. Now, I actually have heard viable answer story points, but more often than not, it's this fun game of, well, John, we did this. I'm like, okay, but isn't there a date on this project? Yeah, but you don't, like, yeah, but I don't get aren't you just reverse engineering the story points to meet the date? Well, if you put it that way, John. Anyway, so I hope you're sort of laughing. I can't hear you when you're doing this virtual, but like hopefully somebody just laughed a couple of times. Conflicting priorities, unknown dependencies, right? I'll tell this story really quickly. One of the stories I love in the Phoenix Project, right? And I'm gonna mangle it, but there's a story about where they're all in the boardroom and somebody's saying, well, why does it take 63 hours to do a 15-minute task? And then and then it's explained to them, okay, let me explain to the very simplistic, queuing theory. And if people are 90% busy and they're doing something that has this, very simplistic, but everybody's 90% busy, which is not too far from a lot of organizations I visit. And everybody has 7 downstream dependencies in everything they do. I got past, like, algebra, I think, and that's not algebra, but like it's what, 62 hours, right? And here's the thing, other two, when I go in and I start asking questions about how they capture work, and I find out that 70% of all the work in that company from the IT perspective isn't captured, and I have this great conversation with the CIO. I'm like, how do we do it, John? I'm like, not real good, Bob. I'm like, what do you mean, John? I'm like, well, let me put it this way. If you built airplanes, I wouldn't fly on them. Oh, John, come on, be a little serious with me now. I'm like, okay, Bob. As far as I can tell, you have a $3 billion IT budget, and you only capture about 30% of all the things that are happening in your IT. And I'm wondering what other part of your business would tolerate that. Finances, we reconcile the books every Wednesday if it's not raining, right? And then, furthermore, when I'm talking to people about that sort of process, I say, why don't you write? Well, how come you don't create a ticket to that? And I don't believe, we have a whole discussion about like ticket queues and all that. That's terrible stuff. But why isn't there any? Why aren't you keeping any electronic document on that work? This work you just told me about. Oh, I've been working with Sally for like 15 years. I know when Sally gives me something, it's only going to take me 15 minutes. Okay. Let me ask you something. Does that thing you do for Sally need file space? Does it need to be dealt with like with LDAP or Active Directory? Oh, of course it does. Of course it does. Like how long those things? Well, that's not my problem. Right. So the context of the view of how long it takes is already skewed because in their mind it's 15 minutes, but it's back to the Phoenix Project story. It's maybe 63 hours. Unplanned work, neglected work, right? Like we got some of that going on. Consistency, shared environments, right? Again, like if I knew how to answer all these questions, I wouldn't be here on this call right now. I'd be on like some ridiculously expensive fishing boat on the Gulf of Mexico, maybe calling people periodically to see how they were doing. But unfortunately, that's not the case. Shared service environments are terribly hard, right? Like if you're running these very complex systems that have legacy code, you can't have 4 environments of certain kind, like TIBCO or large gateways and MuleSoft gateways or whatever, right? Like not every organization, and I can't walk and say, oh, your big problem is you need like 8 of these for everybody. Like, of course that's not going to be the answer, but it's still a problem, right? Because you've got this sort of yo-yo effect on shared environment. Somebody's moving up, you go to test, you got to move it back down to a release. Somebody left some artifact, it's just a mess. Inconsistent environments, things like Ansible, or Chef or Puppet, configuration as code or infrastructure as code, right? Like again, when I walk into an organization in 2020 and it's a plus $2 billion IT budget, And they're like, yeah, next year we're thinking of looking at infrastructure as code. So you just told them you're manually building stuff? Okay, sure. I mean, again, I'm being a little funny and sounding judgmental, but, and I don't do this when I'm doing this with clients, but sometimes you can't help but laugh among friends, and y'all are my friends, right? Unclear roles and responsibilities. You know, we could go through anti-patterns for CI/CD, and just got a ping. My boss is yelling at me. No, that's only kidding. You know, there's tons of stuff written about anti-pattern CI/CD. Cross-functional chaos, right? You know, matrix based, and you know, in one team, there's team members that actually are cross-functional to somebody else, and another group they report to this one, but they're cross-functional. You know, it's just like there's a lot of chaos in how you. And again, I'm not saying like product owners and product managers or technical leads or you know technical product owners and back to the taxonomy, right? Like getting all that straight. Not market oriented. We have a whole bunch of this stuff in the DevOps handbook about that. Here's another area, right? Like strategy, right? Strategy is usually a mess. There's sort of common strategy, or you might say compliance strategy. And then sometimes they are, sometimes they're not in sync with the architect's strategy. And almost always, where companies are emerging on cloud native patterns or decoupling or you know sort of you know maybe microservice to really flesh it out or just sort of going all in on the cloud, a lot of those organizations, the architectural teams and the engineering teams are on complete different planets, right? And then you know I should add network here too, but security and network, right? Like a lot of those are sort of latent. You get through the process, and then security comes in and says, you can't use that version of TLS. Oh, all right, that's going to be a problem, right? You know, so you know we're not. I mean, we're getting better, you know. And again, there's a lot sort of at least Red Hat. You know, just to be clear, I think Red Hat has Red Hat. There we go. Been doing too much work this week. It's a Friday. Um, Red Hat has a lot of really good leadership, starting with and the rest of the organization with GTO. But you know about how we are getting better. In you know we have something called the 5 elements. Andrew, you know if you've been listening to this series, you know you've had it already. Jabe has, you know, Jabe is an inventor of this 3 economy. So, I mean, we're working really hard to solve these problems, right? So, but again, a lot of corporations, you know, this strategy is just, they all have different arrows pointing in different directions. General risk, you know, risk in general, right? I do a lot of work on automated governance. You can look it up. Maybe we'll get some links to some of the projects, or DevOps automated governance, cloud automated governance. But, you know, most organizations are still perimeter based, right? Their mentality was, I can tell you, it was clear. You know, they call these counterfactuals when you go in and you read a postmortem of an organization and say, "Well, I know what they should have done." And so when I say this, I don't know what Equifax should have done because I don't know, but I do know that I got a sense that there was some myopic notion of perimeter based, right? And this is true. Like if I spend a ton of money on IDSs and protect the perimeter, I mean, Martin Casado, who was the sort of the creator of software-defined networking, was creating the Sierra, sold it to VMware, and now he's at Andreessen Horowitz. So he's one of the leaders in network people in the world. Brilliant guy. You know, he said, you know, a couple of years ago, I saw a presentation that our industry spends about 80% of its spend on perimeter base and less than 20% on inner perimeter, right? Subjective governance models, right? So a lot of what we do from audit and control is basically subjective in that you know, what does an audit do? They come in and they look at the conversation in a change record for the evidence or maybe screen prints, as opposed to possibly injecting what I would call objective governance into your pipeline. You know, maybe something like a blockchain and stuff like that. Low attestation efficacy, so that's back to you know a high attestation efficacy. That would be something like you know sort of like a blockchain evidence for audit. Data ops, interesting conversation starting. So attestations for how data moves. You know, most of the largest breach and the most worst breaches are not about like the vulnerability and struts to Jakarta. It's about finding data that probably shouldn't have been sitting there. So if we had attestation models or evidence of how data gets transformed and placed in S3, the NSA breach, same thing. You know, stuff in S3 buckets. So the working model typically, you know, again, not all the same. This is when I start to do I've done with the analysis, I start thinking about what are these things and what order they should be put in, or are there other things I need to add. But taxonomy models, understanding roles and responsibility, community practices, open org stuff is, works really well if it hasn't been added. Really understanding how, 2020 incident and problem management look, service transition, upskilling, and outcomes. I'll go again a little faster. It's hard to do this faster because I love talking about this stuff and I think it's pretty good information. I also think you need to proportionalize your GRC, right? Like, if there's 100 things in your risk definitions, and there are people arguing that there should only be 10, maybe you can compromise at 20 or 30. There's also patterns that I can talk about, or if you hit me up, Jay Willis at Red Hat, talk about how there's this interesting way that you can create sort of emergent GRC. So instead of sort of rewriting all the 400 column risk spreadsheets, or 15 stacks of books of all the corporation's sort of risk definitions, you can actually start building through sort of evidence and emergence. It's pretty cool. Long-lived teams, this idea of whack-a-moling teams, taking a bunch of people and, okay, for the next 6 weeks, we're going to put Sally, Bob, and Tom and Jem together. And then when that's over, well, you know what? I need to pull Bob out of there early because he needs to start this new team. The teams are not learning how to function. There's a lot of research on like how long, I think it's 3 months before a team actually starts to bond. And if you're ripping them apart, you're not getting the whole reason why you might have wanted to go to BuildRun Teams or Two Pizza Teams was for that synergy and bonding. Building trust in the pipeline, I think we understand that. Taxonomies and incident consistency. Invest in common automation, of course. Team autonomy, trust, taxonomies I talked about. Again, you have to break that date-driven, and I'm not saying this is easy because it starts from the top, right? There's build the bank, run the bank, right? Like that is in most companies, that's how it starts. And so you're playing this like shell game at DevOps at the bottom, when at the top, it's already been decided, sort of arbitrated on. There's going to be a part of the bank that's run the bank, and there's a part of the bank that's going to be change the bank. And guess what? If you fall into run the bank, you're the furniture. So we're not going to really invest aggressively in those new fancy picnic tables. So you really have. It's been called Agile Budgeting. I'm not crazy about that term, but like you have to sort of break that. You get a budget at the beginning of the year. What happens? I always say the first quarter, you're like, we got the budget, it's great. Second quarter, like, we really should start working on that. Working out that budget stuff. Third quarter, like, oh my God, we're getting close to fourth quarter. What are we going to do? And fourth quarter, like, Titanic. Organizational change management. Again, I think with everything, we have to move away from quantitative, looking at like from the leadership perspective, like how many of these did you get done? You really have to sort of look at that and just sort of smash it to say, if this is not qualitative, you can't expect somebody. This is a true story, right? Somebody comes in, they're on a project, and the first time that everybody meets about the project, the whole project on the screen, sort of schedule and status is green, and that person says, half of that screen shouldn't be green. And like after meeting, somebody comes up to them, hey, you really shouldn't say that in a meeting. So the next time they come back, the next meeting, they say, oh, you know what? A quarter of that team shouldn't be green. Manager pulls them apart. Like, dude, didn't I tell you? Like, you really should not, you're not a team player. I'm going to ding you next year on your bonus. And what do they do about the fourth, fifth time they come in? Like, Bob, what do you think? Do you think that screen's all green? Yes, Bob's your uncle. Like you have to break it. Agile funding, zero trust model, shift left security. Again, I've got a lot of presentations on this. We've done a couple in this forum. I'm sure I'll do more. Policies code. This is really interesting stuff. I'm about to work on a new working group here. I worked on a paper called DevOps Automated Governance. It's a Creative Commons on the itrevolution.com site. We're actually going to do a second version on that. We're going to really focus in on policy. So policy people writing human readable YAML that gets injected into attestations in the pipeline that become the evidence for audit, right? And if you can get that, you can actually start looking at something like policy error budgeting. I talked about data ops. and then really understanding the new world of configuration. Like we know the sort of Ansible, Chef, and all that, but all the configuration that goes into containers and clusters managers like Kubernetes or OpenShift, like there's a ton of vulnerabilities there, and it's really hard to keep up. So, really understanding, a switch that you turn on in a container could be no op by not turning a switch on an OpenShift, right? So, common language, this is from Jane Grohl, who does a great job of sort of talking about DevOps, SRE, and ITIL. She's an ITIL expert, for years. But just like, it's kind of fun if you look at we can have some funds like a CI for sort of DevOps SRE with continuous integration. It would be called a CI configuration item in CMDB. Configuration management would be something like Chef or Puppet Ansible. In ITIL speak, it would be a CMDB, and you get the point, right? And then and then you have this other thing that I think is important, we do a pretty good job in DevOps Handbook, is sort of understanding the roles of your organization. I think most organizations would agree, but not one size fit all, that you want to move sort of to the right. You want to move away from I-shape, where somebody's an expert in one topic, to maybe T-shape, where they're really good at, like, for example, like an Oracle DBA might be an I-shape. Somebody an Oracle DBA that really becomes T-shaped might actually learn Python, and then really start exploring on having that same level of expertise on MySQL or sort of other relational databases, or maybe even taking on some of the non-relational. And then E-shape, it just depends on where you went. I think I detest the phrase full stack engineer. There's a whole book on it about it, why you should. They test it in the IT Revolution forum papers that I just talked about earlier. But I think E-shape does express somebody who is adaptable. Models. I talked a little bit about models. Again, I'm giving you little snapshots. There's again, it's context sensitive to the analysis. I'm not showing you everything that I put in a report. I'm just giving you little snippets here and there, things that I think hopefully you'll find interesting. But I think this whole notion of team boundaries, team working agreements, and then I think a lot of companies don't do this, but notionally a lot of people sort of in their agile coaching teams basically say they do, right? But I make fun of everybody, by the way, including myself. But the thing that even if they're notionally doing, or they are doing it, the thing I very rarely see is this notion of a team tape API, and it comes from the book Team Topologies, which I highly recommend. And here's an example of it. Like, so each team, because the problem you have is very rarely in an organization does any one team know what other teams do, right? Or worse, what's the architectural design of their system? And in fact, they call this sort of architectural design anthropology, where people have to go find the original MRD, and usually it's out of date and not consistent. And, the requires document is not like anywhere near what existed, but that's the only best that they have. How about a world where the team sort of makes these promises that we'll always support 2 versions? Well, here's our wiki and documentation to the best of our abilities. Here's our practices and principles. Here's how you communicate with us. We have multiple Slack channels. We have ask us anything, and then, by the way, Slack works when you have SLAs, right? We say, by the way, if you go into the ask me anything for our team, expect a 24-hour response. If you go into office hours, which will tell you when their prescriptive times are, we'll promise 15-minute responses, right? And then we'll make sure we show you our Kanban boards and our so getting near the end here. Team complexity and cognitive nodes. Some of this, not all of it, comes from the team topology again. Just having an understanding. I mean, you could say we have nothing. We don't have BuildRun Teams. We don't have 2-piece teams. And next Monday at 3:30 in the afternoon Eastern time, we're going to have BuildRun Teams. Or you can actually do some research and understand some of the models that work or don't work. Again, there are some organizations, I think the Azure model is pretty good, which they use internally, which is they believe that you need, I think there's some researchers that you need 3 months to bond, and you won't get the effectiveness unless you're doing 12 to 18 months of keeping a team together, versus you're sort of losing a lot of the benefit of having those sort of build-run teams anyway. Red Hat, we have some models. I'm not a great fan of Horizon-based, but I worked out with one client how you could do a Horizon one, sort of a Horizon create, like, if you had to have like 10 teams, you could have, or 9 teams, you could break them up in Horizon 1, Horizon, what's it, Horizon 2 and Horizon 3. I always get confused, but some is the innovative, the other is the sustainable. Here's some, we'll publish this, I won't go through this. This is some of the stuff where I got my information from, one of my early things I got called on and said, John, where's the research from? Well, okay, let me make sure I document it. And then let's end up with incidents. I'm a big fan of John Allsbar. If you haven't followed him, he is actually working with some of the two premier resilience and safety cognitive labs people on the planet, Dr. Woods, and Dr. Cook and John, and they really spend a lot of time on incident analysis. And John says incidents are unplanned investments. This is actually a sort of a modified quote of John. I actually did a podcast with him yesterday. He said, he talked about how, like, why incidents are so important, right? Incidents are signals that are the most effective directors of attention of what an organization needs for recalibration. And one of the things John said, and I think is really clear, and again, we spent a whole hour, maybe we'll get John on. We had John on last week. Hey, well, forgot about that. I was on vacation. One of the things that he says is the most interesting time of an incident is from the time the incident is, sort of completed, right? Sometimes they're never really completed. And before you get into the big meeting, like the postmortem, I think most people spend most of their money on the big meeting. And his point is, that's where you actually get to really understand how this thing could be written and exposed as a learning opportunity. Sidney Dekker says, all this stuff in resilience, like a pilot is not great because they passed every test. A pilot like Sully, right? If you watch that movie, Sully was great because Sully could tell stories and he listened to stories. In fact, he had a blog about aviation problems that were stories. So we need to make sure incidents are stories that people want to listen to. And there's a lot more there too. Goals of incident management, trying to get near the end. I'm getting pretty close to the end. You want to reduce unplanned hours. It's just, again, I think the point that it took me a while to really understand what John and Adaptive Capacity Labs were talking about is it's economics. Like, if you can shift the economic opportunity into the analysis of incidents, what bigger part of our organization? There was the DevOps Enterprise Summit recently. There was a presentation by a company that talked about, literally last year, what was it, like an 18-hour spanning tree incident, right? I mean, I asked my network friend, should we be having spanning tree incidents in 2019? He's like, yeah, John, unfortunately, yes. But like 18-hour spanning, I mean, this is like ridiculous money loss, right? Like, we need to figure out how to invest in incidents as opposed to just recording them and throwing them into dustbin documents. All right, so with the 6 minutes I have left, incident management opportunities. You can tell I know it's a Friday, right? Because I'm actually in a cynical, funny mood. You want to learn from these investments to that point, right? Like, let's make sure that we're telling stories and we're not just filling out checklists. If we think about the classic idle assignment management, we're running up to get reports into a system that nobody learns anything about those incidents. Like, it's a bean counter. It's a quantitative dashboard on some executive's screen. Like, where if you listen to John and Adaptive Capacity Labs, like, we should be taking a lot more investment in how we take those stories to learn from. And there's a ton of great stuff there. Some things about service transition improvement. There's a great book on IT. It's a 2019 book. Just look for Scott Prue and CSG. He's one of the authors. This comes right out of that IT Revolution forum paper. This is where you start talking about localized authority, and it goes back to the T-shaped individuals, and you start building BuildRun Teams, right? So what's interesting about this kind of investment, right? It's all about economics investment, right? Like, why would you replicate team skills and not have it centralized? Well, maybe one is that the test person becomes a developer, the product owner becomes part of an architect, ops becomes a developer and tester, because when you're working on a team, you start learning and sharing the responsibilities. And at some point, you have a whole organization of T-shaped people. And so when you acquire another organization and everybody has to adapt to new things, the organization is the adaptive capacity of your organization. I think Jay Bloom, who I work with, brilliantly calls this, let me make sure I get it right, wait, Jay, you're listening. Skills liquidity, right? I think he's written some stuff on this. It's a brilliant way to think about a dojo. DevOps Dojo. I'm a big fan of DevOps Dojo. Immersive learning, creating repeatable patterns. It's not like an excellence center. It's a place where people come over and over to enhance their craft and their skill and learn new things. Making work visible. This is another really good book on IT revolution. Not book. It's a forum paper about the sort of cycle of work management flow from handoffs to batch size to work in progress. And then sustainable approaches. I do think, people ask me a lot of times, like, okay, John, when you leave, what are we going to do? I'm like, well, you need to find somebody that can, so the question that comes up a lot, like, I've had engagements where, because of the, my schedule, their schedule, budget, all those things, you start it and then you don't come back till 6 months later, which I don't recommend. But then when you get back, things are actually better. Like there was some conversations initial that actually changed some things. There were some changes that they made. And then the question from the CIO and the C-level team is, are we done? You think we're better? I'm like, no, but the way you find out is you do this organizational conversation thing over again. And the people will tell you if you're better, worse, getting better. Lean coffee, if you haven't experimented. Slack, internal DevOps days. If you haven't done this, this is brilliant. Again, ping me, jwillis@redhat.com. I can tell you who has done it, how they've done it, internal hackathons, the dojo. And then last but not least, with 3 minutes, man, I did this. It's like crazy. Every Tuesday we have, we didn't have for the last 2 weeks, but we'll have it this Tuesday. And every Tuesday, I think we're going to do it at 2 o'clock. We're going to see if that works. We're on a crowd chat, and it's where a bunch of people, all GTO and a bunch of people Red Hat, and then a bunch of people in the industry jump on, and we have these tweet storms. And if you haven't seen the crowd chat dialogue, it's pretty awesome. And we've had a blast. And then we record those, and we put it on our YouTube channel, the Red Hat Global Channel, and we'll be adding more material to the Red Hat channel. And I am done. Thank you so much for spending this time for you. Like I said, I'm easy to find, jwillis@redhat.com. Botchgaloop on Twitter. I won't spell it out. If you don't know what that is, just look for me at jwillis@redhat.com. Well, thank you. Thank you, Diane. Thank you, Chris.
Awesome. Awesome talk. And I think, and you used up every moment here, and we could have another hour-long conversation. So what I'm going to hope to do is maybe next Tuesday be part of the crowd chat so we can.
Oh, yeah, please come. Yeah, Chris, too, if you got time, too.
Yeah, please do invite us. And I think that would be great. I think some of this stuff, you're never done with this conversation, whether it's inside of your, the whole sustainable last slide there is, I think it's a continuous ongoing conversation. It's like a muscle and you have to exercise it.
Absolutely. So, there's no such thing as done, right? We know that. It's a cliche,
absolutely.
But we forget that all the time. So
but we are done for today.
Yes,
so,
that's right.
Thank everybody for attending and listening. I'll put this up here. John, one of the things I'm going to ask from you is your slides and maybe an annotated bibliography, because you mentioned, and I'll transcribe this as well, a bazillion things that we should all be reading or should have read. And if you didn't read the Mythical Man Month in university or college or wherever you started out and down this tech journey, please do. It's like it feels like a historical document, but it's one of my faves, and a good way to get started. But there is so much. The bibliography for this talk alone is definitely should be part of every techie's library.
I'll get all that to you, Diana. No problem at all.
Awesome. Take care. Have a great weekend. We'll all be talking with you next Tuesday in that crowd chat. I'll send out the link to that, and we'll move this conversation forward. All right.
Great.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everybody.